I am the editor and publisher of Blank Slate Media, and I would like to welcome everyone to our sit down with State Assemblywoman Gina Sillitti, who is running for re-election on the Democratic line for State Assembly District 16, where she's opposed by Vibhuti Jha. Mr. Jha was scheduled to participate this afternoon in a debate with Assemblywoman Sillitti, but hold up. Let me start that now. Hi, my name is Stephen Blank. I am the editor and publisher of Blank Slate Media, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our sit down with State Assemblywoman Gina Sillitti, who is running for re-election on the Democratic line for State Assembly District 16, where she is opposed by Vibhuti Jha. Mr. Jha was scheduled to participate this afternoon in a debate with Assemblywoman Sillitti, but canceled this afternoon. So we will carry on with a one-on-one discussion on the issues with Assemblywoman Sillitti. We will try to schedule a one-on-one with Mr. Jha. This is part of a series of interviews in the candidates running for office this November. And I would like to thank in advance the sponsor of this event and others, Northwell Health. So let's jump right in and welcome. My question first is, why are you running for re-election?
Thank you so much. I'm glad we're able to do this again. The first time we met was 2 years ago when I was running for my first election, and just thank you for hosting this. So the viewers and the subscribers of your paper are able to learn more about the candidates. I think it's really important to make informed decision. Running for re-election, I've been in office for about 1 year and 10 months. And let me just say off the bat, I love the job. I love traveling to Albany, as odd as that may be. I've worked in government for a very long time prior to coming into office and running for the first time in 2020. I had worked at various levels of government. And, if you're from Long Island, there are a lot of them, a lot of levels of government. And I've understood over the years, how to process it and, and how to get things done, how to navigate the process, the ins and outs. I'm putting my phone down, the ins and outs of how government works. And I've been able to, deliver for the residents. And, I feel like we're just getting started. In 2021, we were still remote. It was really, slow in Albany, although I went every week. There wasn't much going on as far as members there, but I went every week. I felt it was important for me to be there to learn the process and get to know the staff. And then here, 2022, it was almost like my first year, first time seeing people face to face, first time going to events in person. And so literally hit the ground running, been able to deliver a lot for the district, I believe, in the first year and 10 months that I've been in office. And I look forward to continuing that work for as long as the voters will have me. And I hope that will be for many years to come.
What do you consider your accomplishments? What are the things that you think you have done for your district and for the state?
Sure, absolutely, good question. So, we talk about deliverables, and I'm going to talk in terms of budgetary deliverables, if I may. One of them being, and you and I discussed this 2 years ago, school aid and school aid funding and how we can do better at the state. And in my first term in office, we've increased state aid to the 16th district by 42%. That's an incredible increase. We're year 2 into fully funding foundation aid. Next year will be 100% foundation aid will be fully funded. In addition to that, district specific things, and we can get into that a little bit more later in the interview if you would like. One of the things I'm especially proud of, and we talked about it again a couple of years ago, was the businesses on Plandome Road. And they were struggling pre-pandemic because of septic systems and the tens of thousands of dollars that they had to pay to pump out the business. And I was able to secure in this year's budget $5 million so they can install sewers. along Plandome Road. It's a boon for the businesses. It's good for the environment, economically, regional. It's good. So that was a real win, I think, specifically for the district. And then also just, the governor had talked about it, and I know a lot of my colleagues have talked about it, is infrastructure spending, money for our roads and bridges. I've talked about it a lot, the Long Island Expressway, getting repaved, Northern Boulevard, which is a nightmare, getting repaved. These are real deliverables that we were able to bring, to the state and to the district, and which I think is important because it affects, people's lives.
So we've heard a lot in the campaign from the public, particularly in the campaign from Republicans, about crime
Sure.
and bail reform.
Sure.
So let's talk about crime. Where do you think we are in terms of crime and what needs to be done?
Sure, great question.
The Republicans are running a campaign saying the Democrats have been remiss on this.
Right.
What's your response?
Sure, it's their number one issue. That's really all they're running on, quite frankly. And there's so many other things. There's a whole breadth of things facing our state, and that, by the way, crime is certainly one of them. Which, as you know, Steve, is up all over the United States, not just in New York. And not everybody has similar criminal justice reforms that we have. Like specifically, we're talking about New York. We're talking about the New York State Assembly, so we'll get into it. For me personally,
I will point out this is a point that we had in our editorial this week.
Yeah,
New York is actually ranked 34th in the United States in crime, which is kind of amazing that that New York is so low. Yet there's the concern. Although, if you're a victim of a crime or you're impacted or your businesses, it's certainly an important thing. But
yeah, true. Listen, there's a whole lot of factors. I think we're seeing additional reporting of crime. There's the perception and then there's reality. People feel unsafe, and that's, and that's on us to make them feel safe and also actually be safe. Now, the criminal justice reforms that everybody's talking about obviously went before I came into office in 2019, before I came into office. So that all being said, since I've been in office, there are certain fixes that we needed to make in the budget to make people feel better. One of them is, common sense changes to bail, giving judges additional discretion for repeat offenders. We specifically catalytic converter thefts and then car thefts. We added more gun crimes to bail eligible offenses. We gave more money to our DAs, made some fixes to discovery law. But me personally, by the way, I think it's important to mention that I have the support and endorsement of every law enforcement agency, the National PBA, the detectives, the superior officers, state troopers, et cetera, which I think is important to point out. Not that they, support a lot of Democrats, we've seen that, but they're supporting me. I think they trust me that I'll listen to them, that I've been listening to them, that I'm a good partner in government. And when they have concerns, they're able to talk to me freely, and that I listen, and that I put the needs of Long Island first, and that I'm advocating for them and for Long Island in conference, which I think is important to note when we talk about in conference. The Assembly Democratic Conference, where, we talk about the bills and we talk about a lot of where the decision making happens, right? And and what I've said to them is this, is that come to me when there is something that's, particularly bothersome. Like, what is something that you're like banging your head against the walls and your guys are like, we have to get this fixed. We have to get this fixed. Then I take that and I bring it to my conference, say, listen, this is an issue that my guys and women are facing, in their job in law enforcement. How can we fix this? Because we've seen this year that they're willing to make tweaks, to the criminal justice reform, to bail reform. So I think the door is open to make additional ones. Me personally, I would like to see, I have a zero tolerance for illegal guns. I think that we can go further. as far as gun possession and gun sale. I don't think our laws go far enough. If that's my personal opinion. But I know that we can prioritize public safety without, going back to the, system that we had before, where there was basically two criminal justice systems, one for those who have and those for those who have not. And I think that we can find that right balance. And I think I'm the person that could strike that right balance. And I believe the, law enforcement trusts me to find that balance and to be that person to advocate for them. And I hope, I hope that they, feel that way as well.
Where do you think there's been two changes already, two fixes. Bail reform started 2020.
Yeah.
It then was changed in April.
Yep.
It was changed this past legislative session.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that wasn't included that I think a lot of people said was dangerousness being a standard for people doing it.
Right.
Do you think that, do you think that you have it right now, or that there's additional?
We can go further. The judges do have some discretion when it comes to that, but I talked about before about striking the right balance. We can give judges this, even more discretion, which I think they should have, but there also should be, some kind of tool to watch over what they do, so they're not disproportionately, or adversely affecting a certain group population.
The criticisms of dangerousness was the fact that
exactly
it's usually Black people that are considered the dangerous ones.
Right, and when the person who looks like you or I did the same exact thing and has a very similar background, so that's what I talk about, having some kind of oversight, and also judges around the state are very different. Even if they're Democrat, Republican, like I feel like the judges in Nassau County may be a little bit more stricter than, say, the judges in Manhattan. So we have to also look at how the DAs are charging people. If there's a crime, if they're charging them for a crime that's not bail eligible, when they could have been charging them with a crime for that, or what the judges are doing. There's certain things that can be done outside of bail reform itself.
Well, let me ask you this, because the state
Sure.
just came out with a study, and this has been, and various news organizations did a similar analysis,
Mhm.
and they found that bail reform has actually had very little impact on the crime rate in New York. High crime, you mentioned other states, didn't have bail reform. It's happened, crime has gone up in red states and blue states and cities and rural areas. So the question becomes, because all this focus has been done, what we're talking about is bail reform. So if bail reform, and if we're going to fix the problem of crime, you need to identify what's behind it. And if it's not bail reform, what do you think it is?
So I can give you an actual very real world example of identifying a problem, putting legislation ahead of it, and putting money behind it. Catalytic converter thefts. That's been a huge issue in New York, on Long Island, in my district, but it's also across the United States. And why is that? It's because it's the precious metals that are in the catalytic converters, and the price of that metal right now is through the roof. You can, make $250 to $500 per catalytic converter, and then, of course, unfortunately, the poor soul who gets their piece stolen, it costs them thousands of dollars to get it fixed. So in the legislature, so we passed legislation, right, that would sort of crack down on this problem, but also giving law enforcement the tools they need to crack down on the people. I don't want to call them chop shops, but you know who I'm talking about, the people who are actually taking the metals. So on the new catalytic converters, there's etching. So that was just recently signed last week by the governor. But what she did, in addition to that, I think it was maybe a few days ago, we were at the State Trooper. She also put a lot of money behind it. money for law enforcement, so they can, so they have the tools that they need to go after these thefts, and then just more money for cameras and just literally millions of dollars to law enforcement, to our state police, and also to our local law enforcement, so they can get a handle on this. So this is like kind of a real everyday thing that happened. It was pushed through obviously by a lot of suburban Democrats, but also it was in the Senate. It was Senator Diane Savino of Staten Island, who's seen a huge increase in her area, and then Marianne Buttonshon, who's upstate, who sponsored it. And of course, I was, supporter of it.
You didn't mention, and I don't hear anybody mention.
Sure.
The rise of mental health problems, opioid addiction, alcoholism that occurred during COVID, or guns. And there was a dramatic increase in guns, and we're talking about violence and shootings. That is, the use of handguns are at the highest percentage now of involvement in homicide, I think, in ever. But why is there no mention of these other factors, and then no more money, or no one is discussing that, and I'll add to that the economic people dying, families being dislocated by members of the family dying and impacted, inflation causing people to not being able to meet and make ends meet. I don't hear anything in that discussion. We're discussing crime, bail reform, and nothing, and bail reform, which there's no data behind that. But why is no one else discussing anything else?
So, I mean, when we're talking about bail, a lot of times, if we want to talk politics, it's been very, reactionary. The one side is hammering bail over and over again because it's easy. It's an easy subject to play on people's fears, because you see it in the news, and it's easy to point fingers and say it's that person's fault. It's their fault for what you see, even though the data suggests otherwise. I mean, Nassau County, I think, was again rated the safest place to live in the United States for a county of its size. So you kind of can't have it both ways, right? But so let's talk about mental health. I would love to talk about it. People who were on the edge before COVID, people who were having a hard time, especially young people, they didn't have their resources. Their personal connection with the therapist was cut off. They were told to go home, stay in a room, and don't have contact with anybody else. And it made it very difficult for them. And I want to make a connection between guns and young people and mental health. Guns have now surpassed everything else as the leading cause of deaths among the young population. And we have strict guns safety measures in New York. We have some of those strictest gun laws anywhere. One of them is the SAFE Act. And I bring that up is because when you're having difficulties and you're having a hard time in life and you're thinking the worst, right? And it's easy to just pick up a gun and end it, right? But in New York, we have these, we have safe storage and we have all these different rules. So maybe that young person, when they go to think about ending their life, they have a harder time to get that gun, to do that deed, the final act of killing themselves. So I'm just making that connection because you brought it up. But as far as, mental health, and we've put in more money, in mental health services in New York. I don't think we did enough. We talked about it a lot. We talked about we need more money for this, more money for that. But it was, next to dying of COVID, that emerged as one of the big, obviously food insecurity.
There's a real shortage of therapists.
Yeah,
and mental health issues, and they don't have an opportunity to even see anyone.
Absolutely. I mean, telehealth has certainly made things easier, and we tried our best in New York to make that easier for doctors to have those, one-on-one visits. But yeah, no, have we done enough? No. Can we do more? Yes. Did we put money behind mental health services this past budget? Yes. But it's never enough. I mean, there's a few bills that I co-sponsored. One of them was to have a mental health professional in every building in every school district. We're lucky where we live. We have incredible school districts with incredible resources. Not everybody is as lucky as we are, right, Steve? We live in a very special place. One example I like to give just because I visited it recently, Manhasset High School. Manhasset High School has this wellness center, I think they call it, but it's a space for students to go. And they have like little donuts where they can just like kind of plop down on the floor and just kind of be. But there's also people there that they can talk to. But if they just need a space to sort of decompress and escape, it's quiet, it's bright, it's a welcoming environment. And, if we could have something like that in every school district, our kids would be, all the more better for it. But those are kind of the things that we need to focus. It's like the second pandemic of the pandemic is this mental health crisis.
And what about, what everyone has, we're discussing this rise in violence at a time when the opioid crisis and alcohol addiction so high. When in the 1990s, in the late 1980s and 90s, the number was during the crack epidemic. New York City, which this year is about 500, and people are concerned with a homicide rate of 500. In 1990, it was 2,300. It was more than 2,300 people. And that was crack, but no one is mentioning the fact that the opioid epidemic and alcoholism, particularly as driven during the pandemic, has a role. And with that, I don't hear the attention to trying to overcome that.
True. I mean, it's one of those things. It's, cause and effect. People lose their job, they're down on their luck, and they need an escape. And sometimes, they turn to drugs, or they have some kind of surgery, mouth surgery, whatever the case may be. And
is the legislature addressing these things? Because it's like the Republicans have said bail reform, and all the Democrats have responded. Mm-hmm. Bail reform, according to studies, is not the impact. Right. We're not addressing the problem, and I'm not hearing the problem being addressed, or all the things that lead to this.
All the things that lead to the crime and everything else.
The rise in crime that has everybody concerned.
Right. I mean, certainly my colleagues have been talking about it as far as how, those issues can be addressed. A lot of times, throwing money at it isn't always the solution. But we have that, knack in the state legislature. I've seen it. It's like, you have to identify the programs that work. So when we were talking about, we've given, tens of millions of dollars to like gang organizations. So I said, all right, so we're going to give this money to these organizations. That sounds great. What is their track record? Are we giving to these groups that have proven track records of making differences in their community? And which I thought was an important point to make. And I was told, yes, that the money that, that they wanted to give to were people who have proven records of addressing, the heart, of the problem. So kind of, get at the problem before it becomes a problem, or, reach the person before it becomes, more than it should be.
Talking about gun safety, New York State has some of the strictest. The Supreme Court took basically voided a century-old law for concealed carry. The state came back, now it's being contested as whether the response was constitutional. But after Buffalo, the shooting in Buffalo with a teenager with an AR-15, The state did, number one, how is it that the state, until then, allowed teenagers to have AR-15s? And then secondly, in a state that supposedly has tight gun laws, and then secondly, why don't you just ban AR-15s? They had no use. They were banned by the federal government. It did prevent mass shootings. Why do it to 20? Now you just wait till you're 21. Why wasn't it an AR-15? Why could teenagers get that and could not get a handgun, but could get an AR-15? And why is it that you can still get it now you're 21, now you can get an AR-15? Why?
It honestly makes zero sense to me at all. I don't understand how we allow people to have weapons of war. My dad was a Marine Corps veteran. I think only people who are in that kind of position should have a weapon like that. Why did it not happen before? I can only guess, Steve. The only thing that I could think of is that, when the Senate flipped, some of these actions that had not been able to be taken beforehand, they were able to make some of these changes. But most recently, I thought that raising the age to 21 was a good first step. One of the things that the legislature did was we passed a resolution, sort of like a sense of the legislature, I guess you can call it, to ask the federal government, a letter to Joe Biden saying, please reinstitute the federal assault weapons ban. As you can imagine, it was along party lines. The disturbing thing about it, though, and I'll never forget this moment. Buffalo had happened, and it was a horrific thing. I sit 2 feet away from Crystal Peoples-Stokes, and she spoke passionately about this. This is her backyard. But it was also days after the massacre in Uvalde, where basically young children were shredded to death by these kinds of weapons. And so, you say all in favor, please signify by saying aye. And, with these resolutions, everybody says aye because it's a resolution. You don't think anything of it. And so I said aye. And then the other side, they stood up and yelled nay. And I'm thinking to myself, like, did you not just see what I saw? Did you all not hear what we all heard about what happened? But I'm just saying that could be why there has been pushback.
Why aren't the Democrats raising their voice as loud for a ban on AR-15s in the state as the Republicans are for bail reform? It seems like the Republicans are much stronger in when they oppose something than the Democrats.
Right. When it comes,
you're even on the campaign. I mean, people are talking about the rise in crime. I don't hear the fact that you can have assault weapons across the country, and anyone tying that to the rise in crime. Even though in his writing his dissent, Justice Breyer mentioned the fact of all the mass killing in this country in arguing for the concealed carry law. Mm-hmm. He's the only guy that I've heard mention it. Nobody else was mentioning the fact that all the mass shootings that took place.
It seems that, and you know what, I don't have an answer for you because I think you're right. We're not talking about it enough. We talk about it when it happens. Everybody's, certainly I was, and my colleagues were, how could this happen? How could we allow this to happen? Why do we have this? What is this? What is this country's fascination with guns? Why are there 1 million more guns than there are people in this country? Listen, I come from a family they were hunters, they had guns around, I grew up with it. That's one thing. But it's another thing to have, these, guns that go around that could literally tear human being bodies apart. We shouldn't have it. It shouldn't be allowed. And it should just be for law enforcement and our military, full stop. Should the Democrats be talking about it more? Yes. I put out a public safety piece. It had a few different issues on it. It talked about bail. It talked about, our strict gun laws. But did I say we should ban assault weapons in New York State or in this country? No. but do I believe we should? Yes.
Now, we know that you are a supporter of the Reproductive Health Act that would basically, New York State has codified Roe v. Wade, and that women have the right to abortion in the state.
Yep.
But there are a lot of people, a lot of women, who don't have access to abortion for financial reasons. And there's a population of undocumented women who don't have access, which is, you would think that conservatives who have opposed immigration and the so-called anchor babies would be first in line supporting legislation to allow them to have abortions, because those children will become American citizens. But what about what about access? What about providing access to poorer women who can't, for whatever reason, afford to get an abortion, or undocumented women who are afraid of being deported?
So I think first things first is that, yes, all the things that you mentioned in New York are true. They've codified Roe a few years ago, basically taking it out of the criminal statute, putting it into the health statute. And then, of course, we passed several pieces of legislation this year to further protect women and also healthcare providers to kind of shield them from retaliation if they help women from outside of New York, because as we know, there's some wacky things happening across the country. Majority, by the way, I don't have to tell you, the majority of Americans, the majority of New Yorkers believe in a woman's right to choose. So I'm not talking, something that's not in the mainstream. But as far as specifically what you're talking about, I would want to make a distinction outside of my particular assembly race, and whoever is going to be the next governor is going to appoint the next healthcare commissioner. And that health commissioner will be in charge of distributing funds. And that person could certainly choke off funding to some of these critical agencies that service the population that you were referring to, right? And so that their access would be diminished by somebody like that.
But some of those people don't have it right now. What about?
They can 100% go into a Planned Parenthood and seek care.
Okay. We're housing.
Sure.
There is a shortage of 750,000 housing units in the New York metropolitan area. Rents, one of the major drivers of inflation is that shortage, rising rents, and the fact that on Long Island, the children of people who are living here can't afford to move back to here because there's very few rental units and houses have gone up. Without the state being involved, the state of California is getting involved because one of the things that was seen is that local control means that they're not going to approve. The shortage is good for people who are living in these communities because it raises the values of their homes. So they're not going to allow it. They've got a financial incentive not to do that. But if there's going to be a response, does the state respond? Now I know that Governor Hochul tried it, and
it fell like a ton of bricks.
Right. So what is the answer then? Is Nassau County not going to provide housing? And it's also people who are looking to downsize, who are older and the kids are out of the house. It's hard to downsize to go to somewhere else.
It's a problem.
What should be done?
It's a problem. It's a problem for everyone. It's a problem for even a New York State Assemblywoman. I live in a beautiful home that I have rented for a very long time because I can't afford anything else. I'm, before I moved in with my now husband, I lived like every young person in a basement apartment, which I think is like a rite of passage for, Long Island young people, because that's all we could afford. Now you're talking about the governor's proposal originally about the accessory dwelling units. Unfortunately, and Long Island has said it, and they spoke loud and clear. They don't want any kind of mandate from New York State. Now, the intentions originally, I thought were good. As AARP was pushing for it, senior groups were pushing for it, to give people additional income if they wanted to, like I said, have a basement apartment or an apartment over their garage or whatever the case may be. But what they didn't want, there's 64 villages in Nassau County. I have 26 of them, Steve. And I heard from every single one of my mayors. And, what they said is, we want to have local control, but it's not just about local control. These are like communities that it's not like they just willy-nilly said, no, we don't want this. It's, years of planning and community input and master plans that have sort of come up, with these neighborhoods. Now, what can the state do? Like, rather than mandating, right? So what's the next step? The only thing, there's a few things. You can put incentives in place for people to come up with some kind of program to add additional housing. The problem is, though, Steve, is that you're not going to see a lot of my villages do it. You'll see more push for like where I live in Manor Haven, and then it'll just get overcrowded because some of these other communities just don't want it. So you have to, find that right balance. Is it more, development? We talk about transit-oriented development, modernizing and adding, along our downtowns and main streets. But then there's also the problem with, traffic. Traffic is already terrible along our downtowns and main streets. So, you have to envision a place where it's walkable, where you go to a restaurant, you walk to the train, and to make it appealing for people where they don't want to be in their cars and they want to be able to walk to their places of leisure or worship or places of business. So incentivizing plans, putting money behind it, I think is the only way to go. But there is 100%, I'm getting over a cold, 100% a housing crisis. I'm living it, and so many other people my age and younger are also living it. There's just no place to go. There is an inventory, and the minimal inventory there is that's affordable is being scooped up with people who have more and are building giant houses on it. That's what I'm seeing over by me. And I don't know what could be done aside from incentivization and transit-oriented development, creating more housing that way. But also to be mindful of people's quality of life and traffic, and that it's a very difficult dance.
Which goes to the question of.
And the other problem is too, Steve, is that it's been so many years of people saying no. I think a great example too, is what happened recently in Huntington. So many decades of saying no that the federal government had to step in because there was some housing discrimination issues. It shouldn't come to that. It should be like careful planning and figuring out what's the best for the community, and also, resources. I talked before about sewers. North Shore has certainly very different needs and abilities than some other parts of Nassau County because of our, infrastructure. And then we had floods during Ida. Like, there's so many factors that are going into it that we have to be mindful of.
So talking about things that are built in, disparity, part of this also with housing is the disparity in school districts, in funding, what we're spending. Your district includes Great Neck. It includes parts of New Hyde Park. Great Neck is spending $38,000 per student. It's among the highest, and Great Neck School is ranked among the highest in the country.
Yeah. People move to Great Neck for the school district.
In Monica, though, we're spending $25,000, $26,000 per pupil. Education was supposed to level the playing field. But in this case, education is actually providing an advantage to the children of the more affluent.
Oh, totally.
Why, I understand foundation aid has increased. This is with foundation aid applied.
Mhm.
There's this enormous disparity. Should there, what can be done to narrow that? Should there be at least a minimum level and spending and let the state make up the difference so that Monica's spending $30,000 per student, and if Great Neck wants to spend $38,000, fine. Should the state subsidize up to a certain level?
So as far as foundation aid, there's certainly school districts, fared better than others. Here on the North Shore, we got millions, but then there's also, as you know, school districts like Roosevelt and Wyandanch and others who are, struggling in the poorest. They got millions upon millions upon millions more with the foundation aid formula. I remember this from, a couple of years ago, we had this conversation and, I was like, if I could fix, the formula and fix this issue, I probably wouldn't be running for state assembly. I would be running for a higher office. I don't know if it's the formula to figure out school aid, I think is flawed. The regional cost index in figuring out the formula has not changed in decades. That needs to take a harder look at. And I think that after we fully fund foundation formula next year, I think that should be one of the things that we look at. One of the other things too is, people have talked about, something more income tax based, but then how do you distribute that money without some kind of consolidation? And by the way, consolidation is an evil word. Because nobody wants to talk about consolidation. They like their individual school districts, and not for nothing. Some areas don't have a defined, like downtown, or, they're defined by their school district. A great example, one of my school districts is Herrick's. Their community is defined by their school district. You don't say I live in New Hyde Park, you say I live in Herrick's if you live in, in that school district. So their community is, defined by that, and to, somehow get rid of that would be a non-starter. But there are people who are, the age-old saying, house rich and cash poor. What do you do about that? There's certain things.
Sure. At the same time, if Sewantica wanted to close the gap,
yeah,
they have to go over the tax cap.
Right.
And then they need 60% of the vote, not 50% plus one.
Right.
So any district that really wanted to, and they might not be able to get the votes to do it,
mm-hmm.
but the bar has been set so high that you've basically frozen in this disparity between the districts. So getting 60% of people to agree on almost anything is extremely difficult these days. So,
but a lot of times, though, we've actually seen it, though. There have been school districts that have, here and there have gone over it. There's so much, people talk so much about the schools being tied to home values, and they're afraid to sort of rock the boat because they don't want, anything to happen to their schools.
Why not lift the tax cap on school districts below a certain level? Why not?
So it goes over.
I would say the tax cap doesn't apply to a school district that's spending under $30,000 per pupil.
It would be incredibly unpopular, Steve, to do that. I mean, quite frankly,
I would that are spending under $30,000.
I would be in favor of, so sometimes it's with it's not always a true 2%, and some of the school districts are having a hard time with that. So if it was a true 2%, I would be in favor of that, because sometimes your tax cap is not actually 2%. You know this, it's like 1.5, whatever the case may be. I would be in favor of something along those lines. But to pierce that, I think with the 2% tax cap idea is probably one of the most popular things that I think was instituted, obviously before I came into office, by former Governor Cuomo. And I it's here to stay. I can't imagine ever doing something different with it. But a true 2%, I would be, willing to consider.
You're taking taxpayers' ability to decide for themselves away from them.
But the problem is that the school districts were spending too much, and it was going, the people's taxes were going up.
But they were voting for it.
I,
It was being voted by the taxpayers.
by like four people. You know what I mean? It was a very small amount of people. By the way, that goes to a whole nother thing. I think we should consolidate elections so more people participate in the electoral process, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Let me ask you congestion pricing.
Sure. Talk about things that are unpopular.
Okay, but number one, we're also congested on Long Island. Anyone who drives the highways or even off-road, we're seeing the fact that I live off of Roslyn Road. Go Roslyn Road and go up to Northern Boulevard. And most times go take Lakeville Road to Great Neck from New Hyde Park. Take the LIE in to the city. Not to mention that right now where there's a war in Ukraine, Russia is benefiting from gasoline prices. Iran is benefiting, Saudi Arabia is, and it's pollution. So why not congestion pricing in Manhattan where nobody is paying? We're getting, essentially, we spend all this time, people from outside Manhattan spend all this time, but they don't pay for any of the services needed to maintain it.
Sure. So I'm glad we're talking about it. So two things. One is that all the studies that were done pre-pandemic. I feel like we're in a different world now, Steve. There's people's riding patterns are different. Less people are taking the trains. More people are driving in their cars. And so everything that we know about congestion pricing was all looked at prior to the pandemic. We're in a whole new world.
But aren't more people driving? I mean, if the roads get more congested, if you drive into Manhattan.
So the whole point of congestion pricing is to get people back on the trains.
Right.
But people are not doing that. They don't want to take the trains right now for whatever reason. For health reasons, they're still.
Wouldn't congestion pricing encourage them to do just?
But they don't want to do it, is what I'm saying. Is that?
Well, that's why you need incentives. That's the point. That's the point of it. They need.
I hear you. I hear you. I hear you. Additionally, New York Times, I believe it was, talked about how the congestion would actually move away from Manhattan and into the suburbs. So you talk about having, congestion on the roads now, there'd be even more congestion outside of it. Now, what I've been saying from, when I was first asked about this was there is a bill either being introduced or recently introduced by David Weprin of Queens. And his bill is to, for lack of a better word, kick the can down the road bill. Give a couple more years to see sort of where we land in this new post-pandemic world. Let's not rely on old data from, previous 2020, and see what new ridership patterns are, and then reevaluate. Now, there is congestion in Manhattan. There's pollution. People, I don't have to tell you, have, all kinds of asthma issues and everything else. We're too reliant on our cars when we have some of the best transportation systems in the world. I wish more people would use mass transit, but they don't. People go into the city for hospital visits and all this kinds of things. And they feel like they shouldn't have to pay for that. But what I hate that happened in this whole process, Steve, is that the hearings, and I don't know whose brainchild this was, had the hearings on congestion pricing in the fall of an election year. And so I don't think that we had a real honest conversation about the benefits or negative impacts of this proposal because it was too politicized. One side is saying it's going to cost you 20 something dollars, another person saying it's going to cost you $36, another person saying it's going to cost 40 something dollars, when in reality, if you have an easy pass, it's going to cost you $9. And so the whole thing became politicized, and we didn't have real conversations about it, which is why I support something to kind of push it a little further. But in the concept of it, I'm not, completely opposed to, but I think right now it's not the right time.
But right now you have Russia trying to freeze Ukraine and the rest of Europe during a war, supported by Saudi Arabia and Iran. What about, the extra price or the congestion? What about the people that are suffering in Europe? And not to mention that this increase, we're talking about inflation. You want to look at gas prices going up. Well, having more people to drive into the city does not help.
I hear you. And, supply and demand, obviously in 2020, our gas prices were incredibly low because nobody was going anywhere. Then all of a sudden, everybody got back in their cars, and all of a sudden the gas prices went up. And then of course we have this, war in Ukraine, and gas prices soared and blissfully seem to have, plateaued. And now recently the corner gas station just went down a few ticks. I think that may have a little something to do with increased oil production in the United States.
Biden is using the reserves, our reserves.
That's exactly what I'm referring to. Yep.
What about the protection against future disasters like
Sure.
Hurricane Sandy, and we just saw Hurricane Ian, and I think it was Governor Cuomo who said, it seems like we're getting 100-year storms every other year this year. I think I've seen it like the 100-year storm has become every 20 years,
Right.
Or 10 years now with Sandy. What has been done since? It's 10 years. We saw what happened with Hurricane Ian, and the storms are getting worse.
Yep.
The climate is worse. There's more water in the atmosphere. It's warmer in the ocean. Are we protected in this area? Is Long Island protected? You live in Manor Haven.
I'm right on the water. I mean, my house isn't on the water, but we're right there.
This is something that I think might concern you. What has been done? What has the state done to protect people who are living anywhere really in the water? But I mean, we had storms, and everybody was impacted from the entire Long Island from Hurricane Sandy.
Yeah, I mean, and Ida too, I think, was a great example of that. I mean, it was a crazy, I think they called that one a 500-year storm, when people had like literal rivers running through their house. And by the way, nobody had flood insurance because half these people are not near any kinds of bodies of water, or they're outside the flood zone or above and it was terrible. So let me talk to you really quick about what I've done and then what I think the state can do in the future. And I can't speak to too much what they've done, but I can talk to you about what we're doing going forward. So Hurricane Ida comes through Long Island, September 1st, 2021. And it was devastating. It was devastating to my district. And it hit all kinds of people. Obviously it's wealthy, all the way to the folks that live in Manor Haven in my area. And one of the stories I like to tell, I went and I knocked on doors right afterwards, and I assessed damage. I told people to reach out to FEMA because we had to get a certain threshold in order to get FEMA assistance. It was $5 million, and walked around with the county executive and with local mayors and that sort of thing, encouraging people to get, and we eventually got FEMA assistance. But I went and we had mudslides in Manor Haven. I'd never seen anything like it. And I followed the mud literally that was in front of my house. It was like a little river. And I got in my car and I followed it. And I came across this house, and there's a man standing in front, and his name was Hassan Imam. He lives in Manor Haven. And he's just standing there, literally surrounded by 8 feet of mud that had enveloped his property. So in Manor Haven, we're right below the cliffs of Sands Point. So Sands Point is like up here, Manor Haven is down here. So the rain, what it did was it literally took the earth and slid it down onto people's homes and onto the streets. It was crazy. So FEMA comes in, fast forward, and people had tens of thousands of dollars worth of damage. FEMA comes in, they give you 10,000 here, 14,000. This is across my district. Certainly not enough. And again, nobody had flood insurance. A handful of people had flood insurance. So what I did was I asked, there was floods upstate, Lake Erie, and the governor's office of storm recovery put together this fund to help people with additional costs. And I was like, well, you could do that there. Why can't you do that here? So I put a letter together, asked a bunch of my colleagues, everybody from Long Island signed on. And I was like, let's put in money to help these people. And we got, at the end of the budget, back and forth, we got $41 million for Hurricane Ida relief outside of New York City, which is an incredible amount of money. It's federal money that's being, through the governor's office of storm recovery. So there's a whole bunch of rules attached to it. Hopefully in the next month, the application process will begin, which I will, of course, let my constituents and everyone know about how to apply. And it's to rebuild, and fixes, reimbursement for what you've already done, but also resiliency to fix up your properties personally to prepare for future storms. So that's individual. And then, sure.
We spend money for people to rebuild. Should we be? In all cases, who's making the decision? Because if there's another storm,
what are we doing to protect them?
Do we want to really be paying? Do we really want to be paying for someone to redo their home in a place that's going to be that's?
But that's the thing. Like it's Long Island.
It's going to happen again.
Yeah, well, but these are places that it should never have happened to begin with, because they're like in the middle of the peninsula. These are literally places that are miles from the water that just shouldn't have happened. So then that goes to the second point, is infrastructure upgrades. So there's two things that are happening right now. One is we got additional money in the budget for like municipal stormwater grants. So like, local governments can apply for this money to upgrade some of their infrastructure, because we saw that the infrastructure that we have now just couldn't handle the massive amount of water, these 500, 100-year storms. And unfortunately, climate change is real, climate change is here, and we're going to see the increased frequency and intensity of these storms, so we have to be prepared. So what the state can do is put money to help local governments expand and fix their infrastructure. Nassau County with their sumps and their catch basins, dredge them, expand them, do whatever you have to do. Come up with some kind of, I think the county should be doing this now. Laura Curran had talked about it. Hopefully the new administration will do that, to do an assessment of all their infrastructure to see where the weaknesses are and what exactly you need to do to fix it. And some of that money we passed, and this goes to the voters in November, the $4.2 billion Environmental Bond Act. It was bipartisan, wholly bipartisan. So hopefully it'll have no trouble passing the voters. Certainly it was bipartisan on Long Island because, everybody here understands the issues. But it'll go to projects like this, Steve. It'll go to, infrastructure upgrades, shoreline resiliency.
It's going to happen, but it hasn't happened.
Correct. It's going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. I mean, I've been pushing for specific district fixes in the budget. Some things I just couldn't get over the finish line. One of them is along Manhasset Bay. There's some stuff that needs to be shored up on the shoreline, for lack of a better word. I'm still pushing for funding for that, but it's millions of dollars, right? I did get $250,000 for town of North Hempstead to do some shoreline resiliency over at North Hempstead Beach Park, but so much more needs to be done. And I'm, listen, as I mentioned before, I'm in the majority of the assembly, and I have the ability to push for those funds, and I will continue to do so.
Okay, I think we're reaching our 1 hour limit that I've set on myself. I want to give you final opportunity. Why should voters select you versus your opponent
Sure.
in
Um,
the upcoming election?
Thank you. So first of all, this was a great forum. I love talking to you. You really, are so, knowledgeable on all the issues. I think we had a really great conversation. I mean, definitely we're two different candidates running for office. We care about, and hopefully you'll get a chance to speak with them and make that work. I hope voters will trust me on the issues that matter most. Women's rights we talked about, voting rights we didn't talk about, the environment and what I can deliver as a member of the majority in the assembly, increasing our gun laws, specifically illegal guns, public safety we talked about briefly, what we talked about mental health. These are issues that I believe that I can deliver on. And I did mention before about the endorsements, but I think it's important to mention. It's important to mention because these are people that trust me, from law enforcement to environmental groups to unions to everybody in between. They trust me to fight for them in Albany. I hope that the constituents will do the same. I've made being accessible and transparent a signature of my time in office. I've hosted mobile office hours where I've met, hundreds of constituents to hear their concerns, hear their ideas for legislation. And this is something that I'm laser focused on, and I look forward to continue the work of the people as I mentioned before, in hopefully years to come, and I'm just getting started.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Gina Sillitti for participating in this discussion. I'd also like to again thank Northwell Health for sponsoring this afternoon, going into evening's discussion. For those who are unable to watch today while we were doing it, a recording of our discussion can be found on Blank Slate Media's website, theisland360.com, and on our YouTube channel. You'll be able to, you can go directly to the YouTube channel by clicking on a link on theisland360.com. And a story about this evening's event will appear in the 6 Blank Slate Media newspapers next week and on our website, theisland360.com. Assemblywoman Gina Sillitti, thank you once again.
Thank you. Really appreciate it, Steve.
Okay, thanks.